Clash Royale is a very unbalanced game. Ever since Evolutions and Tower Troops, the meta just doesn't exist anymore. But really, when looking at it, this has kind of always been the case in the game. And I think there is one time period in Clash Royale history that exemplifies this more than any, and that is the end of 2019. From September through December of 2019, that might be the worst meta in Clash Royale history. Worse than the Monk and the Phoenix meta, worse than the meta with the first evolutions, and even worse than the current meta with the insane Goblin cards. So let's hop in our time machine, rewind back to 2019, and take a look at this absolutely absurd meta. So like I said, we are starting with September, and this wave of balance changes was really the beginning of the end, I guess you could say. So most of the balance changes here are normal, you know, Royal Ghost buff, P.E.K.K.A nerf, Dark Prince nerf, Goblin Cage nerf, you know, those are pretty normal. But this Executioner rework was massive. And then we'll talk about the Fisherman a little bit later. So for the Executioner, his damage almost got doubled. He got a hit point nerf, then some changes to his range, a hit speed nerf, but then also a buff to how fast his axe returns. At the time, the Executioner was a pretty underwhelming card in the game. Not many people used it outside of some niche hog decks. So this was an attempt to make it a much more appealing card. But this was way too much, absolutely. And based on feedback, they would actually emergency nerf this rework before it was even implemented in the game. So here's a Reddit post detailing that rework. Just so you know, this was made by Supercell Seth. This was the guy that used to do Clash Royale balancing. I believe he now works on the Clash of Clans team. And you can probably see why he left the Clash Royale team. So they changed the damage increase from 98% to 82%. They changed his minimum range to be 3 tiles and the max to be 4.5 compared to 3.5 and then 5. And then the hit speed reduced was also the same. But then based off of this feedback, people were saying that they actually killed the Executioner. And that mainly had to do with this range rework. Making the minimum range of 3 tiles, it just made his range way too short. And with how much health he had, it made a lot of cards be able to overpower him. And that's even with this damage buff. So here's the craziest thing. They would then emergency buff the emergency nerf. So within the span of like a week, this card got 3 separate reworks. Crazy. And so courtesy of a old Clash with Ash video, we can see what that emergency balance was. They changed the minimum range to be from 3 to 4 tiles, and then they also gave it plus 2% damage as well. And so what was the result of all this? Well, the Executioner ended up being better, but not insanely broken. So it actually ended up working out pretty well. But it was just like so chaotic. I mean, look at how this Executioner functions. Look at that damage and look how short its range was. That's absolutely insane. They just took this card and they made it something that it wasn't, which is just... That range is just so short. And the damage, that almost took out an Electro Wizard. Now there is a 1 level difference, but that's so much damage. So ultimately after that, Executioner ended up being a good card, but nothing overly broken and nothing overly weak. It was honestly in a pretty decent spot, which is weird enough. Oh yeah, I didn't even talk about the Fisherman. We still have to talk about that. So for a little bit of context, the Fisherman was new to Clash Royale in July 2019. And when it was released, it was pretty bad, to be honest. Its hook mechanic was still really cool and really new, but it overall just wasn't that good of a card. So ultimately, they decided to give it a pretty significant buff here in this wave of balances. They made its elixir from 4 to 3 and then nerfed its damage to compensate for that. And really, this elixir change was all that he needed to become a top 5 card in the game. It's actually crazy. And one of the things that made him a top 5 card beyond his insane utility for only being 3 elixir was also the fact that he did not die to lightning. A 3 elixir card that does not die to a 6 elixir card, that was very problematic. So to go along with the second emergency balance for the Executioner, they decided to nerf the Fisherman's hit points by 5%. But even with this nerf and with Fisherman dying to lightning, he still remained a top 5 card in the entire game. This is an incredibly old video I made from 2019 detailing some balance changes that I wanted, and the first one that I talked about was a nerf to the Fisherman. And I read off the usage rates and win percentages of it here. So let's take a look and see how high they were.
Yeah, Fisherman. 37% usage rate, 58% win rate.
37% usage rate, 58% win rate. That is incredibly busted. So all of that right there was incredibly chaotic. But we haven't even reached the most chaotic part yet. So the worst of this begins when we move to October 2019. I am still a firm believer this was the most chaotic meta in Clash Royale history during this month. So let's go over these balances and break down what the heck we're looking at? So the big thing this season, the witch got a massive rework. Now, most of these were nerfs. A hit point nerf, a hit speed nerf, splash, spawn speed, death spawns. Those are all pretty big nerfs. But then we have this ridiculous buff, 220% damage buff. And then also her spawn pattern was changed so that way the skeletons spawned around her instead of being in a straight line. The witch had pretty much sucked for years, so this buff was an attempt to make her really good. And that buff definitely worked. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Oh yeah, and another thing I totally forgot to mention, this was the season when the elixir golem was added. And that's a really important detail because the chaos wasn't just caused by these balances, but it was also caused by one of the most ridiculous card releases in Clash Royale history. Like when the elixir golem was first released, it just did not die. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. All right, we have an elixir golem at the bridge. Look how little damage that Ewiz is doing to it. This thing had so much health, it could tank anything. And again, remember, this was only for 3 elixir. You could put anything behind the elixir golem, a night witch, a fisherman, then play a miner on the tower. And I mean, that's literally just tower down. That is so broken. And by the time your opponent gets their elixir back, you've already taken their tower, so it doesn't even matter on their end, basically. And then, you know, you play the witch, and she does her thing. And then the wall breakers, we'll talk about them as well. And then just cycle back to another elixir golem, the witch spawning her skeletons, which can help out with the inferno tower. Let's look at the witch and see how much damage she does. Look at that. Look how many skeletons she's spawning. Look how much damage she's doing. What was going on here? Also, yeah, shout out Clash with Ash for the gameplay from 2019. Anyway, going back to the balances, you saw the Night Witch there in that gameplay. Yeah, she also got a pretty significant buff here. Her death spawn bats were buffed back from 2 to 4. The death spawn bats were at 4 when she was released. They were gradually nerfed down to 2 to balance her more, but then they just buffed it right back. When Night Witch initially had her 4 death spawn bats, she was one of the best cards in the game's history. And this kind of brought her back to that point once again. Now, as a certified Night Witch lover, I was not complaining during this time period, but I can still admit it was incredibly unhealthy for the meta. Then I feel like a really underrated part of this meta was this wall breakers rework. They were a pretty terrible card since they were introduced, but this rework to make them 2 elixir made them so much better. Elixir changes are just insane for cards. Even if it's just 1 elixir, it's insane. Then the fisherman also got a nerf here. It got a damage nerf and a hit point nerf. But this really didn't matter. The fisherman still remained one of the top cards in the game. And so speaking of top cards in the game, let's take a look at what the usage rates for all of these cards looked like. So here's kind of what the meta looked like. Ignore my 16-year-old self. I look a bit stupid. But here's kind of what the top of the game looked like. And just looking at this gives me a lot of flashbacks, man. So the witch was the best non-spell in the game. Half the people in the game were using it and it was having pretty high win rates. The elixir golem was insane, 34% use rate, extremely high win rate. Night Witch was very comparable as well. And then like I said, fisherman, it was still great. It had a 28% usage rate. And then there's our boy, the executioner. You know, he was still hanging around, but he wasn't anything too crazy. So here's something interesting. I believe the best cards in this time period were the witch, the elixir golem, the Night Witch, and the fisherman. Well, if that's the case, then why weren't they the top 4 cards in the game? Well, that's because other cards had to be used to counter them. The poison had the highest usage rate in the game because it did so well with the witch and the Night Witch. The baby dragon was also good at countering them. You know, it could take out the bats from the Night Witch. The Valkyrie doing splash damage was great against the witch and Night Witch. The Mega Knight was great against these cards. Yeah, also Sparky was meta a little bit too. What were we doing here? What were we doing here? And also, they put out a blog post talking about why they weren't doing an emergency nerf. The community was so fed up with this meta, but it lasted for an entire month and they didn't do any emergency nerfs. Ultimately, their reason was they said they needed time for data and play testing. I think in this case, you really didn't. You can just look and see how good the cards are. You didn't need data for that. Ultimately, I think data has been the downfall of Clash Royale, but that's a video for another day. But at least in this post, they did announce that Witch, Wallbreakers, Fisherman, and Elixir Golem would be getting guaranteed nerfs in November. So let's look at November. Did they hold up with their promise? Yes, they did. Witch, Elixir Golem, Wallbreakers, and Fisherman all got nerfs. And just as fast as the Witch rose to prominence, she died. She had 1 month in the spotlight, and this nerf basically killed her. Then Elixir Golem got a pretty big nerf as well, minus 10% hit points to all 3 of his forms. Wallbreakers got a massive damage nerf, as well as a damage radius nerf. Fisherman got a big nerf to his hook range, and then they nerfed Baby Dragon as well. I didn't really think Baby Dragon needed a nerf here. The only reason he was really good was mainly just as a response to everything else that was good, you know? Oh, and then the Executioner got another rework. Wait, yes, that's right. Executioner got another rework, and he is the star of November. So like I showed here, Executioner was doing pretty fine. 9% usage rate, 47% win rate. Those are fairly good stats. As you can see, he was one of the better cards in the meta. But Supercell was just like, hey, let's rework him again. Just make him that much better. And so that's exactly what happened. In this meta for November, Executioner was the best card in the entire game. Let's look at some gameplay of this Executioner and just see how insane he was. Also, look at this deck that Ash is showcasing. Mega Knight, Executioner, Sparky. What are we doing here? So there's Executioner. There it goes, just completely taking out a flying machine and a skeleton barrel by itself. That is a +2 elixir trade. Yeah. Let's look at it do damage to a tower. Yup, that's real. That was some good damage. Watching old Executioner gameplay is so fun. The fact that this card was allowed to be like this, unreal. I mean, yeah, you could just do Mega Knight Executioner at the bridge, and look at the Executioner deal with those barbarians. It two-shots them. Well, technically one-shots. It just throws its axe once, and then when it comes back, they die. Look at that. Look at that damage. Look at that. This is unreal. This is unreal to look at. Ay. So anyway, here's what kind of the top cards in the meta looked like. Executioner, 35% usage rate, 53% win rate. It was basically the best card in the game. And as you can see, there is no witch here. She completely fell off. Miner still remained good because Miner Wallbreaker Cycle was still a good deck. You can see the Wallbreakers, they have a 60% usage rate. You can see Elixir Golem was still doing pretty decent as well, 15% usage rate. And Night Witch was still doing great with a 24% usage rate. So then with that still being the case, other cards like Valkyrie, Mega Knight, and Baby Dragon still remained relevant. Then the Magic Archer was another big player in these Miner Wallbreaker Cycle decks, so it was pretty good. Then of course, as you can imagine with the Executioner being this popular, the Tornado was extremely popular as well. They were just an unbreakable synergy. Like that 8 elixir combo could pretty much defend anything in the game. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention earlier, Bomb Tower was a really good building, the best building in the game at this time. Its splash damage dealt really well with the Elixir Golem and stuff, so you can see it has almost a 60% win rate. Bomb Tower was great. So overall, this meta wasn't nearly as chaotic, but the strength of this one card, the Executioner, still kept it being a super chaotic and just absurd meta. But luckily, this would be fixed, but they did it in the most interesting way possible. So at the end of November of 2019, Clash Royale did a wave of balances where they would completely revert the Executioner rework as well as the Witch rework. And the funniest thing is like this right here. We owe you an apology. They straight up admitted to the fact that they screwed up so bad and ruined the meta so much that they just apologized. And I'll be honest, I respect it in a way. You know, they wanted to try something different, making 2 cards relevant that hadn't been relevant in a long time. I commend their efforts. It was just a very, very poor application. So at least they owned up to their mistakes. But even with this being the case, this emergency balance didn't come until the end of November. So the Executioner was just dominating for almost the entire month of November. So after the big reworks had been reverted, you would think everything would go back to normal, right? Well, you would be wrong. And that is because we have one more card release to talk about, and that is my girl, the Battle Healer. She was released in December of 2019, and she just finished off the year with an absolute bang. To be completely honest, her release was only problematic for the first couple of weeks because people thought she was insanely broken initially, but then her usage rates and win rates kind of calmed down a lot as people figured out how to counter her and stuff like that. Like, she was still a good card, but her usage rates shot down from like 35% to like 15% within the span of a month. Like, here we can look at the meta and where it was at the end of December, and you can see she was still a really solid card, but nothing like overwhelmingly broken. Really, the most broken card in the game at this time was still the Night Witch, because even though the Witch and the Executioner and Fisherman had gotten multiple nerfs and reworks, the Night Witch got nothing after her bats got buffed. So here she is chilling at almost a 40% usage rate, just being literally everywhere. However, even though the release of the Battle Healer really wasn't that problematic, the problematic thing that came from this was the development of a new archetype that many would consider the most low seal archetype in the game's history. And that would be the unique combo of the Elixir Golem and the Battle Healer. Now, even though both their usage rates weren't that great, when they were combined with each other, Oh my gosh, absolutely insane. And then you pair that with a Night Witch as well, and then throw the Electro Dragon in there too, and even a Tornado. Oh my gosh, probably the lowest skill deck in Clash Royale history. I'm not even joking. Even with evolutions being out, like Elixir Golem Battle Healer still probably takes the least amount of skill of any deck to play that this game has ever seen. And in case you were wondering, going into the year 2020, yes, the Night Witch and the Elixir Golem would both be nerfed yet again, and this would tone them down a decent bit. They both still remain good cards, but the Night Witch wasn't nearly as oppressive as she was at the end of 2019. Again, I still firmly stand by the fact that this 4-month stretch was the most ridiculous meta in Clash Royale history. From the Executioner getting 3 changes within a week, from the Elixir Golem release and Fisherman buffs and Witch reworks and Night Witch buffs and all of that, this meta was absolute chaos, and in hindsight looking back at it, it was kind of fun. If you don't think this was the most broken meta in Clash Royale history, leave a comment and let me know what you think was the most broken meta in Clash Royale history. Watch this video next, and I'll see you all in the next video.